In 1889, Copper King W.A. Clark and 74 other men wrote a state constitution to serve the needs of Montana's powerful interests, with a weak governor, a secretive legislature, and special tax deals for the powerful. After 60 years under the copper collar, Montana was declared the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The Anaconda Mining Company even owned most Montana newspapers, the Copper Press. The corporate dominance of Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. 70 years after statehood, the Copper Press was finally sold, and thousands of World War II veterans had been educated under the GI Bill. Newly enlightened Montanans wanted out from under the copper collar, and big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Changing Montana's constitution was the top priority. Strengthening the governorship, opening up the legislature, empowering citizens. Voices of Montana women, totally silenced in 1889, rang out loud and clear for these changes. When the Constitutional Convention began, 19 women were among the elected delegates. And when the delegates came together in convention, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, men and women, young and old, sat alphabetically as equals, Montanans just wanting to make their state better. And so they did, producing a constitution for the ages, the last best constitution. Now, at its 50th anniversary, Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time shine a light on the creation of this remarkable Montana Constitution.
Welcome back to Last Best Constitution. This is another episode in our series discussing and dealing with the issues and the personalities who helped put together Montana's new Constitution in 1972. We're just on the 50th anniversary of that, and it's an ideal time for us to look back and see how did this all happen. We had a Constitution written in 1889 when we became a state, and that Constitutional Convention was chaired by the most nefarious of the Copper Kings in Butte, W.A. Clark, William Andrews Clark. And they drafted a constitution that was drafted for the powerful of that time. Mining interests, large stock growing interests, railroads, and they ended up with a constitution that had a weak executive, a secretive legislature, and a kind of an obscure judiciary, and a lot of other things. Special preferences were in that constitution. The proceeds of mining, for example, constitutionally could not be taxed. So over a period of 83 years, from 1889 until 1972, we lived under the old Constitution. And that Constitution, that period of time, became known as the copper collar time, that we were wearing the copper collar. The control of the economic, social, and cultural and political aspects of Montana were controlled by the old Anaconda Company. And people were tiring of that after World War II and the GI Bill, and people were getting educated. We had finally all the newspapers were owned by the Anaconda Company, all but one daily. And they sold those in 1959, and we had a new press with new young reporters and kind of an open air of new information that people didn't have before. And people in Montana started hungering for change, and the culmination of that change was the Constitution, which started in January of 1972, that convention, and it went 54 days. And then they adjourned a little early, but they got their work done. It was a marvelous piece of work, and we happen to have probably the best state constitution in America and one of the best constitutions in the world, according to legal scholars. So that's what we're trying to get into and record. And we're talking to people that were involved in that process. And today we have a really interesting and a special guest, Ed Smith. Let me just say that Ed just recently retired from 30 years as the clerk of the Montana Supreme Court. But that followed a period of time when he had a lot of other activity we're going to talk about, including the time he spent in the Constitutional Convention. So welcome, Ed. We're really happy to have you here.
Well, Evan, I'm pleased to be here. You and I go back a long way.
I like to think that about 51 years ago, wasn't it?
1971, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. I went on the board for the Democratic Party, and you were our executive secretary at the time, and the rest is history, as they say.
We like to say that. Not sure we're responsible for that history, but yeah, you were a young person who was very active in the political governmental arena, and part of that ended up being with the Democratic Party, which I was with, and that was in '71, late '71, after we'd finished the '71 session, which set up the Constitution. And then also we had the sales tax that session in '71, and we also had the executive reorganization, which I came out of and was part of that before going with the party. And you actually go up before that. You know, when we think about you being a rostrum officer, you were an officer in the Con. You were up there on the rostrum. Your official title was reading clerk, but you helped make the whole thing run well. But you had started that way back in '69, was it, or '67?
Right. When I was a sophomore in high school at Helena High in 1969, I was hired up at the legislature in the state senate as a page for the full session. And then I caught the bug, as they would say, and I like to tell people that in those days, in order to get a job at the legislature, you had to be sponsored by a member. And every member of the Senate had one position that they had to fill. And I was sponsored by Carl Lurkine Jr., a Republican state senator from Bozeman.
Bozeman, yeah.
And so that's how I got my start. And then 2 years after that, when I was a senior, I liked it so well, and I think they liked me, so they gave me another position up there as the assistant bill coordinator in the Senate. And then I went to college, started in the fall of '71 at Missoula, and of course I was very interested because I had watched and listened to the debate about calling for a convention, putting it on the ballot, getting it passed, and so anyway, I sought to have a position up there and was fortunate enough. Mick McEwen from Anaconda was basically on the administration committee, kind of on the subcommittee.
He was a delegate. He was the second youngest delegate.
Next to me.
So he was attracted to you for your youth.
Well, I'd known his dad in the state senate, Luke, and so anyway, he was able to arrange to get me hired, and then I went up to the rostrum as the reading clerk, and had a phenomenal 50-odd days up there.
What an amazing experience. But your rationale for you being there was that you'd had experience in making the machinery of the processes of the legislature function. And this was essentially a unicameral legislature. It was a one body, not a House and Senate. There were just 100 delegates.
Right.
But they still had to go through all the machinations to get stuff done.
Right. And I think that was one of the reasons I was hired, because I had been the assistant bill coordinator in the Senate 2 years before, and so I had to route the legislation through the Senate in that capacity. And so when it came to working, I understood, processes and things like that. And anyway, it was just a wonderful experience for a 19-year-old college freshman, and was able to work with just phenomenal people. I mean, Dale Harris, who was the executive director, just did a outstanding job in his recruitment of those research analysts. They were young and dynamic, and I guess I could say they were products of the time. I mean, people were on the move. They wanted to basically reform the way we operated in government. You know, there was a lot of strife going on in the country, and these young analysts were hired, and boy, did they do a great job. And to see them in action is something that I have always treasured.
Well, you know, it's a very interesting process they engaged in, and all this research up front, and it ending up in the hands of the delegates. But when the delegates were on the floor and they were pontificating on an issue, or they were arguing about something, or if they were in the committee and you remember the public and you went and watched, you didn't necessarily understand all the underpinnings, the stuff that supported that process. So while they were on the floor and we were watching them on the floor, you were making sure the bills were moving, the motions were recorded, the journal was being done, that the microphones were on.
Right. We had to make sure everything was working. And in fact, I think I'd mentioned to you in a previous conversation, we had a situation up there that after the 71 session, they put in brand new, very expensive New Zealand wool carpeting. And so you would get shocks from walking across on this carpeting.
Static electricity.
Right.
Yeah.
And but we had also, the legislature had also installed in the summer of 71 a new voting machine, and the printer for it was kind of on the corner of the rostrum, and so we had to record all of these votes, and so we go across the rostrum to try to pick up the vote,
and print it out. It was a printer.
The printout, right, and it would cancel it out because of the static. So we'd have to then redo the vote, and Leo Gribble was very patient that way, and he'd say, well, I hope the machine is working well today. And
yeah, you didn't learn how to fly over to that. We needed a drone.
That's right.
We needed a drone to avoid that static electricity.
And I should say the people that I worked with on the rostrum, John Hansen was the chief clerk. He was a young man from Winifred, but had been in school at the University of Montana. And then we had Rosemary Aker, who was the journal clerk, and who had worked in the state senate a number of years. And then we also had Rosella Wilson, who had worked in the House before, I think as the journal clerk. And they were, great women to work with. And then we also had Marie Durkee and Gwen Blacker, who actually recorded the transcripts. This that we see here, that's their handiwork.
Yeah.
And so those were the 6 of us that were on the rostrum, and then Leo presided, and he had some back problems during that period. So and we had long sessions because the decision of the convention, and particularly of Leo as the president of the convention, was to let people talk. And so, but he would sit up basically on a big stool, like a bar stool, because it was easier on his back. And so we had quite a time up there.
Yeah, no kidding. Now, and of course, Gwen Blacker, who then died in a car accident about a decade later. A real super person. And, and you want to talk, and she and Marie Durkee had to have the secretarial skills that were not just all American, they were all universe, those people. They really could produce stuff. Pretty amazing.
They transcribed it all.
And they'd be doing it in shorthand.
Right. And the other thing that I can mention is that the whole convention, at least the floor portion of it, was filmed. So we had bright camera lights focusing on us, and it would get hotter than blazes up there. And but because of that, you have all that documentary information on, what happened on the floor, which is a really important.
Now it's interesting.
matter.
Now let's talk for a second about what you did after the Con. Well, let me just ask you this question. Did you take a leave of absence for the second semester, or was it still on quarters then?
We were on quarters then.
You missed a quarter, did you?
No, we went. It worked out because we were starting that quarter at the end of March, so I was able to get back. And
you missed the winter quarter then.
Started my spring quarter, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Just had to stay in school a little longer or take more credits.
Well, I was a freshman that year. I just started. I'd only done one quarter when I went over there. And but you wanted to know what I had done, before and after. As I said to you earlier, I worked from 1969 through 1987. I worked 10 legislative sessions and the Constitutional Convention. And I was the chief clerk of the House. I was elected by the House of Representatives to be the chief clerk in 1973. I was the youngest person in Montana ever to go into that position, and I held that for 3 sessions. And in fact, it was the only, I was able to preside in the only annual session that they had, because our wonderful Constitution provided for annual sessions. But
so when they started in 73, we had 73, 74, and we were going to have them go on forever.
Right.
But of course, that got thrown out by
we did not, what the public...
The First Amendment to the Constitution was to go back to biennial.
Right.
Yeah.
And what happened was, when we started the 73 session, you have the normal amount of legislation that's coming in because we have biennial sessions. And so then we not only had all of that to deal with, but we had all the implementation legislation to deal with. And it stood up this high when they brought it in to my office to begin to implement this thing. So the legislature, we had one 60-day session and 2 special sessions after that for a couple more weeks in order to get through. But we also ended up having the situation that we had to hold bills over because some of them needed to be studied. And what happened is that the lobbyists went crazy. They did not like this. And so a number of them basically said, we're going to go back to having sessions every other year. And they were able to
And that was done by initiative.
Right. They collected signatures and got it on the ballot. And then we went to 90-day sessions beginning in 1975.
Yeah.
And again...
But you were there for the 3 years straight. I was at the same time.
Right.
73, 74, 75. And it was like, boy, this is a different world.
Right.
It really was, but some people didn't like it.
Well, they were used to, they didn't like the fact that legislation was being held over. They either wanted it passed or killed. And if there's something that they didn't like, it really made them nervous that this thing was hanging around.
Oh no, I've got it. I'm going to have to kill it next year.
Right.
And it's just going to sit there. Oh my God, I thought I had it killed.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was very unfortunate because the constitutional, when the legislature met in 73, we had to go in on January 1st because it was, the Constitution was going into effect. And so the caucuses hadn't met until like the 28th of November. We had 1 month to get organized for that session and for the new Constitution. So there was a lot of work. And again, it was unfortunate, but we went to the 90-day session.
Now, one of the reasons, and by the way, that 90-day session only passed by a couple thousand votes.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was very tight. But it did pass, and it put us back into the cycle we've been in for the last 50 years, or 48 years. One of the reasons the people called a constitutional convention, when you look at it historically, was the secrecy of the legislature. It was very clear to people that, hey, this isn't working right. I go to the legislature and they have a committee hearing and I'm sitting there and they say, now when you say executive session, it means only the legislators can talk around the table, but people can sit around and watch. In the old days, before the constitutional change, the executive session meant the chairman of the committee would hold the hearing, and then he'd say, "All right, we're going to executive session. All of you leave."
Yeah, they lock them out.
Everybody left.
Yeah.
With only those, and then when they took the votes, they were secret votes.
Right.
And one of the things, the hallmarks of the legislature under the old Constitution, was not a requirement for openness and not a requirement for votes to be recorded. So when you were when the implementation of the Constitution was taking place, one of the implementations was the way you, as chief clerk, and Speaker of the House Gerke, had to organize it for openness. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, as you just demonstrated, everything was closed under the old Constitution. I mean, chairman would kick people out of the room when they wanted to take executive action, and so we had to inform all of our committee chairmen, your processes have to be open for public sunlight. They have to be able to see what you're doing, and you have to record all the votes, amendments, everything. That all has to be recorded. And so then when the bills got to the floor, it was the same thing. We had to record
let's talk about
everything.
the committee. How happy were the committee chairmen to know that they had to operate differently?
Well, some of them recognized the importance of it because they had supported the adoption of it. But some of them, they had worked under the old system, and it was pretty convenient to do things behind closed doors. And so anyway, we just have to tell them, no, you have to do this, and that's the way it is. And Harold was very good that way. He was a very respected, legislator and former mayor of Billings. And so anyway, we worked through that, but there were a lot of votes. And the other thing that comes to mind, Evan, is that in those first few sessions, if people had a conflict of interest, they would stand up on the floor and say, I cannot cast a vote on this because I have a conflict of interest. They wouldn't necessarily identify what it was, but maybe, they had a financial interest in something that was going to be affected, and they were very good that way. Now that kind of petered out after a while, but people, were very cognizant of the fact that, they had a responsibility and not to have conflicts like that showing up with their votes.
In the old days under the old Constitution, second reading in legislative process is where they debate it on the floor, and where you can amend it.
Right.
Because you can't amend it. Third reading's a final vote.
Right.
And those were always recorded votes.
Second reading, the committee of the whole.
But third reading was regular votes.
The final
they had
vote.
to record them. But meanwhile, the committee of the whole, second reading as they call it, was debate and amendment.
Right.
And under the old Constitution, those debates, they took votes and they went up on the board, but before they were never recorded.
Right.
The board was shut off.
Right. Right.
And so you never knew which legislator voted for what on second reading, perhaps the most important vote.
Unless somebody had a good camera up in the gallery,
Yeah, we did have a story about a con delegate who had Rod Hansen, who had taken a picture of a board and took off with his camera, and they sent the gendarmes, the sergeant at arms, everybody after him to go capture the camera.
Right.
I mean, now if knowledge is power, for citizens to have power, they needed to know what people were doing in the legislature.
Right.
So the constitutional change I liken to a shifting of power. Power rested with the legislators and the lobbyists and people who knew the insides.
Right.
But the citizenry didn't know. So the Constitution created a more powerful electorate, a more knowledgeable citizens.
Well, we want sunshine, I mean, when I look at what happens federally versus what in Montana, we just have this dynamic document that looks out for the public interest.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. So, I was going to mention to you, Evan, about the Constitution. One of the things, since I dealt with the legislature for a long time, I think, in my opinion, one of the I don't want to say problems, but I think it's a shortcoming, is that we went to single-member districts. And I really believe that when we elected people from multi-member districts, you had a broader cross-section of the public, and we've ended up, especially in the House of Representatives, where the districts are smaller, it's almost a legislature of aldermen. And I could tell the difference between those people that served prior to the election of '75, when we went to the single-member districts. And I think it's a mistake. The quality has really not been.
It's an interesting thing, because a lot of people make the argument that by smaller districts, the legislator can know the voters and the voters can know the legislature, but you're suggesting that the legislator would have a broader interest,
Right.
and maybe a broader perspective.
You had to get, if you were going to run, and however the lines were drawn, you had to get a little bit of support within the community. And we still had a broad range of people that served under the old system. But it's just right now, there's been some really fine people, but I also think that there's been some of them that are really lacking.
Well, we're all able to evaluate legislators and everyone else. Having conducted so many interviews.
And this is on both sides of the aisle, too. Not just...
Having conducted a lot of interviews on this, I would have to say that your position about single-member districts is a minority.
Absolutely.
Most people say, oh, that was a great thing. So it's nice to see in a democracy that we have differing opinions.
And I got to see it both ways.
It's kind of like going through annual sessions and then saying, what did I like better, the annual or the biennial?
Right. Depending on where you're working.
And so now back to the operation of the convention itself. You were on the rostrum. Leo was up there.
Right.
He had a open mic type of thing. He said, look, people should be able to speak as long as they want to. And it would serve the purpose well, because people never felt like they got cut off.
Absolutely.
But sometimes it might, Maine Ann Ellingson, then Maine Ann Robinson, likes to always tell the story that he would say, Mrs. Robinson, are you done yet?
Right.
But he had some...
And also sent her the note, you can sit down now, Mrs. Robinson, I think.
and yet, now I heard an anecdote about somebody who might have been a little long-winded, and you were involved in the process of say, constraining that. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, this one particular individual did like to get up and talk, and he was long-winded, and he would pause a lot of times. And so this one day, it was a busy day, and all of a sudden Leo, President Graybill, leaned down from his perch on the rostrum to me, and he said...
This gentleman was, or this delegate, was still talking.
And he said, the next time there's a pause in his speech, cut the mic. Which we did, and then we went on to the next person. Leo called
very quickly called the next,
and then this other individual that had just had his mic cut off is standing in the back of the room waving his mic like, but I've got more to say. It was like the teacher's gone on,
There's a human side to all this stuff, isn't there?
Right. Oh, no, absolutely. Those delegates worked hard. They were long hours. They had long hours in the committees, and then, of course, once the proposals got to the floor, things went on.
So you tell us about your sense of, let's say, the officers of the convention. They elected 5 officers, East and West chair, vice chair, the president, the East and West vice presidents. Then they had a secretary,
Gene Bowman.
And didn't they have one more?
No, they were the 2 vice presidents, and then the one, John. Well, you had John Toole, who was the overall vice president.
The first vice president.
Right, and that was John Toole, respected gentleman
he had been from Missoula.
Right, that was Ross Toole's brother. Right.
Had he been a mayor already, or was he a mayor later? Do you remember? Because he was also mayor of Missoula.
I think he was mayor prior. I think that
he
was
clearly couldn't be a mayor at the time because he wouldn't have been able to run.
Right. No elected officials could run for it. You had to be out of office or just a layperson.
Do you recall the legislators who were told they couldn't run yelling, "Ouch"?
After they had voted to put this thing on the ballot, right? Like hoping that they could go and make their mark, you know. But no, and then we had...
So John Toole was, you had Leo Graybill,
right,
the president.
And then John Toole.
Right.
And then you had Dorothy Eck from Bozeman, and you had Bruce Brown from Miles City, an attorney. And then you had...
East and West.
East and West, right. And then you had Gene Bowman and as the secretary from Billings. And I'll tell you, Dorothy Eck was just great. I mean, all of the women were great, but she and Gene Bowman and then Daphne Bugby, they were very instrumental with the League of Women Voters, pushing for constitutional revision. And we all in Montana owe those women and the others that were involved in the group a great debt of gratitude. They were just phenomenal. And you know, and Leo, as everyone knows, was no shrinking violet. But I sat in a number of staff meetings with the officers, and you didn't have to worry. Dorothy always spoke up.
And Leo always made what his point very, very well too.
Absolutely.
You know, there's he ran a tight ship.
Absolutely.
And when it was all over, everyone respected the results.
Right.
And that.
Well, there was just a $500,000 appropriation to run this. For, I guess it would have been technically up to like 60 days. Normally in the legislature, one of the chambers would have had triple that amount to run. So you realize that he had to be careful with spending the dollars in order to get this thing, you know, through. And but anyway, it worked out.
They like to say that he got it done on time and under budget, and particularly had saved some budget so they could use it to help promote the Constitution.
Right.
And what happened to that idea?
Well, and then it was challenged by some folks, and the court said no, and the Supreme Court, Montana said no, you can't.
With public money, you can't do something political with it.
Right, that's what happened. So then they had to rely on themselves to raise a little bit of money and to get the members out in the communities. And as you know, Evan, it barely passed, but it was in the major, population centers that carried the day. It
passed in every urban area big,
right,
with the exception of Butte.
Right.
Which was the home of the Anaconda Company, whose ox was being gored by the reduction of power.
Right.
To them. So.
And they decided to maybe not get behind it.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, we're just very fortunate that it passed.
And that money that was they saved was left over. I think they kind of thought, and it took a good month for the court to act on it, and suddenly they were there without any money. My recollection was there was a previous commission that Jim Felt had worked with down in Billings, and they had about 10 grand left, and they got that 10 grand.
Okay.
Plus each of the delegates was putting in money.
Right.
But it became a grassroots campaign.
Well, and the thing about it, the other thing is that we need to give her due, and hats off to her, is Betty Babcock.
Yeah.
She and Tim, the former governor, owned the Colonial, and she allowed them to use the offices out there to really, mimeograph things out and photocopy. She just turned the operation over to the.
She became one of the stalwart supporters of the Constitution.
Absolutely.
And provided that administrative support and strength.
Right.
There's an anecdotal story that was repeated at the 50th reunion this last summer. That's someone who really knew what she was talking about, who worked closely with Betty, said that Tim was hosting a bunch of the old politicos at their house,
right,
and they were sitting around really dissing the Constitution. They were just complaining about it and saying how terrible it was. And the more she listened to it, the angrier she got. And finally, she said, she put down some cookies. She says, "You guys serve yourself. I'm going out, and we're going to pass this Constitution." And out the door she went.
Right.
And helped them all the way.
Right.
And was a really big part of getting it, making it a bipartisan.
No, absolutely. And I think that what I'm thinking about now is that when you look at the people that came there, and they ran on a partisan basis, although we had 6 independents, once they got there, once they finished electing the president and they went through all of that, they really rolled up their sleeves and they worked together. It was for the common good, and that's something that we're missing today. But these people were dedicated to that, and they came from all walks of life in Montana, variety of ages. So, all the stars lined up to do this, Evan.
And they did sit alphabetically.
Absolutely.
So there wasn't
our friend Chet Blaylock was the one that suggested that, and we should have more of that in the legislature.
Doesn't that seem like such an obvious thing?
Right.
You don't choose sides and each going over here like this.
Right.
You sit next to somebody. It forces you to work with people.
Absolutely.
And that is singled out as perhaps the most important administrative step that when I hear from people in all the interviews that we do is the alphabetical seating.
Do you suppose that Chet, being the old school teacher, that something came about because that's how that came about?
Yeah, it's very, very, very interesting.
Right.
And it did work out well that way.
No, it did.
People worked together, and when you talk about the common good and you think about the U.S. Constitution and talking about being formed in order to form a more perfect union. There was an effort to form a more perfect state here, and their vision was collective. Not that it didn't have arguments,
right?
But when it was all done, all 100 signed it,
which is remarkable, And in the end, I think out of that, what's the number that basically then wouldn't support it?
Well, I think there were 8 or 9 that might have been against it.
Right.
That voted against it or campaigned out there in the sticks against it, but they all signed it because of a sign of good faith, I think.
Right. Well, and it just they had respect for one another and the work that had been done, which is pretty remarkable,
Wade DeHood told me in a discussion we had, and I recorded it in an interview. He said that when they all went up forward to sign it, and there was he said, I had a little bit of I wondered, is there anybody not going to sign it? He said, I watched them go up one after another, till all 100 had signed it. He said, you know what? He said, it brought tears to my eyes.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
So you think about that, it kind of does for me even now as I talk about it.
Right.
That sense of unity and a unity of purpose and working for the common good and a more perfect state was made better and more effective with that alphabetical seating. And I don't know. I think some days I like to make that a mission to see if we could do that. We can't probably get it done in Congress, but we might get it done in Montana.
Right. Well, hope springs eternal. You know.
Well, you know, getting people to change their ways is not an easy thing to do. I mean, that's a human trait.
Right.
So if you talk to legislators that are there now, and you say, maybe we should get rid of the center aisle thing, it'd probably have a lot of resistance. But I bet if you ask the people, I think the people would say, you're darn right, we need more unity.
Well, you know, again, if you're in a room with other people, it kind of takes the horns off of them, so to speak.
Sure.
You know, like, oh, well, they've got a point there. You know, we could incorporate this, or we could do that. You know, and especially if you're sitting by somebody side by side, you're talking to them. You're talking about what their life is about, what their family's doing. You know, all this kind of stuff, and that helps. You know, basically derive better public policy, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Now. Let's go back and talk a little bit. We've talked about the officers. Let's talk about Dale Harris. You know, in the Crucible of Change series that I did, there's an episode on Dale who regretfully passed away at a younger age, very prematurely. But that episode of Crucible of Change is entitled "A Godfather of the Constitution," and he was seminal in all the development of the Constitution. Tell us about your reflections on Dale.
Well, I mean, he was just this brilliant, dynamic man, and I hats off to whomever it was. Did he go to work on the
he worked
preparatory commission?
He was the staff guy head for the Reform Commission and the Convention Commission, both commissions.
And it's my understanding, it's something I'm recalling now, did somebody say that it was Marge Brown from Missoula that brought him over, recommended him? Because I believe he was in the graduate program under Ellis Waldron.
Yeah, he was with Ellis, who was instrumental in a lot of good people coming over. And I'm sure Marge Brown recommended him, and he was he had actually done some analysis when the Legislative Council. Remember, before there was a Reform Commission, there was the analysis of the Legislative Council,
an interim study.
And they. They came up with this how much percentage was good. You know, fully a third of the Constitution, they said, had to be thrown out. It was useless. And he worked a bit with that, and then over there with Ellis, they was working in the Reform Commission was the next step, and he was the staff director of the Reform Commission. And became staff director of the Constitutional Convention Commission. And then the staff director of the Convention itself.
Well, and he was the one that made the decisions on who these research analysts would be. And when you look at some of these people, you know,
amazing
Rick Applegate, Bruce Sievers, Rich
Bechtel,
and Jim Grady. You know, just amazing people.
Karen Beck was on there, and Sandra Muckleston, Roger Barber, These were really amazingly talented.
Oh, and they were, you know, they had the energy and just the commitment to really compile this information for these delegates. Then, as they began to kind of weed through all this information and try to write, you know, a great document. So, and for me, and I was 4 or 5, 6 years younger than some of these people, just to see them, I revere them because of the work that they did. They just were amazing group of people. And the other folks that worked with us, the other support staff like myself, were great, you know. Really wonderful people. Some of them had come out of the working for the legislature. And,
you know, I think of Dale, and we call him a godfather of it because he was involved in all those steps all the way through. And he was so prolific, and I've had some people say that in those days you didn't diagnose it that way, but he was a little bit, you might say a little manic depressive. He when he was in his manic phase, he could produce volumes of everything. He just produce everything, and then sometimes he would crash. And he'd need a rest.
Right.
And I think somewhere in the convention he had to take a break for a little bit.
Right.
He'd had so much on him, and he'd gotten it so far.
So much pressure, and there was a lot of pressure just because of the fact of the amount of money, and President Grable was trying to manage it, and what happened was, in the end, he took a brief leave of absence for a few days, but when he came back, they split the duties. He became the research director, kept his salary and all that, and then Max Baucus was the committee coordinator, and he continued in that role, but picked up a few more administrative duties.
Yeah.
And so that helped. It's interesting with Dale because years later, this would have been in the late 80s, I ran into him, and I'd see him periodically, and he told me, he said, I've had some incidents, but I finally been diagnosed, I'm bipolar.
There you go.
And this is like, well, it had to have been in the late 80s, and because again, I ran into him at a bookstore.
That explained this, when he was on the manic side of bipolar, well, he was like...
Well, in any of us, the pressure that you would have been under anyway, because you had 60 days to try to write this, seminal document, and trying to just get everything coordinated. I mean, it'd be enough to make anybody exhausted. So, but anyway, he was just, if it wasn't for him, we would not have the Constitution that we have today.
Isn't that the truth?
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
He was just a bright star, and unfortunately, he was taken from us too early, as he had cancer. And but anyway, we were very, very fortunate to have him.
There's a convergence of a lot of forces, a lot of political forces, a lot of personalities were converging and working together. That there was an amazing amount of talent.
Absolutely, not only, but the wonderful delegates. Like
the delegates,
like I said, coming from all different walks of life, they were of a different generation of people. Some of them older, some of them middle-aged, but they had been raised, in a time where, again, the common good was a factor. They were promoters of their communities. It's what I said about Betty, civic-minded, absolutely civic-minded. And unfortunately, we don't see as much of that today. No. But we were just very, very. Are there
any particular
fortunate.
Delegates that you've mentioned? Chet, you mentioned Betty, you've talked
Dorothy.
About some other Dorothy Eck and Jean and the officers.
Right.
But other delegates that stand out in your mind?
Well, I had mentioned earlier before we started, I think of like Carl Davis
from Dillon,
Dillon, who was just an outstanding delegate. Excellent, outstanding attorney. Of course, there was the...
He did have such a wonderful way with people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He was very well regarded. And then, of course, Maynann, 24 years old, 25 years old, just amazing. Mick McEwen, young guy. I'm trying to think of course, you had George Harper from here in Helena, the minister. We had two. We had Bill Burkhardt. And then, I tried to, Mags Ostheim, who was the runner-up to Leo, very well regarded, former legislator from Sheridan County.
Northwest Montana, or Northeast Montana.
Right. And you can't, you had Dave Drum, from Billings, who was a big backer of the convention and businessman from down there.
People don't know that Dave Drum was the president of, and the creator of KOA.
Absolutely.
Council of America is a Billings firm.
Right.
And its corporate headquarters are still in Billings.
And I was just looking at my list. Well, of course, and Wade Hood, my good friend, just outstanding. And I think of when the Declaration of Rights article was being debated, talking about an open process, because if you were an employee of the legislature, you couldn't go in and testify. But he allowed us, the young people, all the interns, to come in and testify on the ability that 18-year-olds should be full fully vested as citizens of Montana with all rights. And I remember I went in there and testified, and before it was in the Senate chamber, they had a big hearing that day, and so it was. He was amazing. Just when I think back on the people, they came from all different walks of life, and
pretty amazing, but amazing group of people.
Right.
Really.
Well, I think of like Catherine Pemberton from down in southeast Montana.
Yeah.
Right. She was a big believer, and with my court background now, she was a big believer in reform of the judicial article to have the judges not elected, but to do
appointed, the Missouri system.
Right, and to have them on retention votes.
Yeah.
And I can honestly say that the judicial article is one of the weaker ones.
Mm-hmm. In our discussion, it was kind of like there was a reticence of the legal community to want to see change.
That's a very good way to put it. And the one thing that, of course, we have the Judicial Nominating Commission. Of course, that's kind of gone by the wayside now. But it was to try to bring some professionalism to the appointments of the judges. That doesn't mean that under the old system that judges, when they had a vacancy, didn't appoint some good people. They did. But is to get more public input.
Yeah.
That was the important thing. The one clause that I don't understand that they added in there, right now the commission, or used to be, the names would go in,
right,
and then they would give the governor 3 to 5 names, and they would appoint,
right,
he would pick, or she would pick one, and then they would go ahead and they would have to run at the next election.
They'd have to be confirmed.
And that's what I was going to get at. The confirmation thing, that's ridiculous. That should not be in there. Mm-hmm. If they're going to go to the ballot, the public will confirm them one way or the other.
That's an interesting thought.
I don't believe in that, and so why that was thrown in there, I think
it was maybe kind of traditional, because often there was a mirroring of the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution required, even though they're lifetime appointments, different.
But in Montana, they always had to run.
Oh, yeah.
They had, after you got that appointment, you had to run for the remainder of the term.
Well, a lot of interesting things. Now, they... were you privy to any of the conversations, and I'm sure you recall it on the floor, the conversations that related to, hey, we can't do that, because if we do that, like for example, if we get rid of a bunch of state elected officials, we're probably not going to pass this thing, because people were worried about the vote. Do you recall the conversations that of them saying we have to be careful? For example, let's not put unicameral. Because we could get the whole thing killed.
Right. That's why the
side issues. They
put them on as side issues. The death penalty, gambling, and
unicameral.
Right. And speaking of that, we need to recognize our good friend Arlene Reichart, who's still with us, and of course she was the one that wanted that, unicameral legislature, and then of course Bob Kelleher, our friend down in Billings, he wanted a parliamentary system. But
Arlene still to this day says, I dearly still love the idea of unicameral, but we did the right thing by making it a side issue.
Oh, absolutely, because
we'd have been DOA.
Right, absolutely. The thing would not have passed, because the forces were there anyway. So to have given them extra ammunition, we would have had some problems.
Yeah, it was close as it was. Mm-hmm. I liken it to, though, the 65% of the people voted to call a convention, because they understood the shackles under which we were operating. Right. But once it got all written down and put out for a vote, suddenly the forces of the powerful, who suddenly were disempowered, the convention and actually wrote a constitution that empowered people, not economic interests. Economic interests then decided to oppose it. A good example being the vote in Butte and Anaconda. And so all of a sudden that 65% came down to about 50.1%. And that's a sign of what the powerful can do politically.
And I don't recall, because I was back in school, and of course they took the vote in the June primary of '72. So I don't know. I don't recall the advertising on the other side. Was it a lot of newspaper advertising?
There was a certain amount of that, but it was such a short period of time. There were mostly debates and stuff like that, but there certainly were some small newspaper ads and stuff. The world of politics was a lot different back then.
Right. Well, don't you think, I mean, from what I understood too, those local delegates were out there, you know, on their local radio stations and things like that promoting it. They were using the free time that they could get, you know, to promote this.
And of course, in those days, there was a fairness doctrine, so then they had to bring somebody in to talk against it, as the radio stations had to do. But it did work out, I think, fairly well. Now you spent, after you spent all those years in the legislature, you ran for clerk of the court. And you had, how many 6-year terms?
I had 5 6-year terms, right.
Wow.
So I was 30 years as the clerk of the court, one of the longest serving statewide officials.
Yeah.
You know, actually the longest serving statewide official, since you're kind of a history buff, is Frank Murray. He was clerk of court and secretary of state.
Yeah, you put them together,
Right.
Yeah.
And then the next one would be Max Baucus.
And he was just a little more than Jim Murray in the Senate, James Murray in the Senate.
Well, Murray was only in for 24 years. Max was in, what, 30?
No, actually, Murray started, remember, he filled the term when Erickson went out. So he was from 1934 until 1960. So that was
24 years.
26 years.
26 years, right.
But the Max ended up overcoming that.
Right.
But that, of course, is federal.
Right. But, and I also worked for the U.S. House. I was
You did, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I worked back in Washington from '79 through '82, and worked on the floor of the House, and that was a wonderful experience.
You've had an amazing career. Now, let me ask you, as the Supreme Court had to be the judge of the constitutionality of statutes, and had to make decisions that often fleshed in the meaning of the Constitution. Are there any particular court cases that come to mind for you that stood out in that time that dealt with the Constitution?
Well, the two, and I'm sorry that I can't recall the actual titles of them, but the Clean and Healthful Environment, one that Justice Triweiler wrote, given where we live in this magnificent state, that's a very important thing of implementing, you know, and giving teeth to the Constitution.
That was really a question of whether that language was meant to be rhetorical or whether it was meant to have some teeth.
Right.
And he said, no, you gotta do it.
And I think with what we're going through now in this country after the Dobbs decision, the privacy decision by our court, a number of years back, is extremely important and fundamental.
The right to a woman to choose to have an abortion or not have an abortion, have a family, et cetera, those kind of decisions, which were granted by the Roe versus Wade and now thrown out, they were not explicit in our Constitution. But we have this extraordinarily strong privacy right.
Absolutely, and that's the way our court interpreted it, you know.
They say that your right to privacy includes your right to make decisions about your health care.
A woman's reproductive health care is their right to make. You know, and under the decision of the court.
You remember that. You remember that case well.
Right. I do remember.
And the Clean and Healthful Environment one too.
Those two.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of wonderful things that have been done over the years through all this stuff. Now, what are you doing with your time now?
Well, I'm a happy retiree. I retired after 50 years of being involved in government politics, retired on January 7th of 2019, and have been enjoying myself, a little bit of travel, but not as much as I wanted because of COVID, but we're hoping here in the next year or so to venture out a little bit more.
Well, your interest and participation in this was evidenced in one more way, which was that you were a fairly long-term member of the Montana Historical Society board, were you not?
I was on the board. Well, I was on the board. Governor Schweitzer and then Bullock reappointed me. I was on for 7 years.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm delighted that they're finally Montana is finally getting an enlarged museum to showcase our history.
Yeah,
You know,
a wonderful history, and you've been a big part of it. Well, it's good for you to join us here. We're getting close to the end of this time, and I really appreciate you taking the time from your busy retirement to come down here and share your history with the Constitution with us. And it's really a pleasure to have had you here.
well, thank you,
my
and-
friend.
Well, my friend, it's been great. You know,
Yeah.
good memories.
Yeah. So for all of you who are viewing this great series, Last Best Constitution, we're glad you joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode.